The first time I saw Fidel Castro was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I remember Ed Sullivan telling him that he was a hero.
You are in the real American tradition of a George Washington, of any man who started off with a small body, fought against a great nation and won.
All of a sudden, they were talking about Fidel Castro as the enemy. And I first heard the word communism. And he was a communist. I mean, this was a man that was scary. This was a monster.
Senor, not so far from here, there's a very lively atmosphere. Everybody's going there this year, and there's a reason. The season never closes there. Love and music you'll find everywhere. People always having fun down there. So, come along. Come along. Come along.
I never really thought about Cuba. I mean, I was born in Portland, Oregon, and that's about as far away from Cuba as you can get. My 10th birthday fell between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of our beloved President Kennedy. My father was an Air Force pilot in World War II, a product of the American dream. We lived in a fantasy world. Our world was about to change. I first started to sense that something was wrong when my father went out and he bought tons and tons of canned foods. We had a little room in our basement, and my father stacked it from floor to ceiling with canned foods and survival gear. He joined the civil defense. He went out in the neighborhood and helped all our neighbors do the same thing. Prepare for a nuclear war.
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
When the missile crisis came, my father spent most of the 13 days in the White House. And so we didn't see much of him, but we knew something was going on. My uncle, the president, made the announcement on TV. My father talked to us on the phone, and he said that we had to be good soldiers and show up at school, and that in any event, that if there was a nuclear war, that none of us would want to be around afterwards. Castro wanted those weapons on Cuban soil to protect Cuba from an invasion by the United States.
And with the lack of communication of that time, it could happen on one place or another. It can happen in Cuba, can happen in Europe, can happen in the Far East. Each small mistake could bring us to the confrontation. As my father repeated, if we lose control, we will not be in charge. It will be military who will follow this.
The military and the CIA believed that we had such an advantage in nuclear weapons that we should be provoking a nuclear showdown with the Soviet Union. Curtis bombs away LeMay, the guy who had bombed the Japanese. Said, this has got to be done. We've got to do it now before the Soviets achieve parity with us. Jack said, well, how many U.S. casualties are going to be? And they'd say, only 47 million. But we're going to impose 187 million on the Soviets. And Jack walked out of that meeting and said, these people are crazy.
At the same time, Khrushchev got a letter from Castro saying, I'm certain that the Americans are going to invade. Go ahead and fire the missiles. Wipe them off the face of the earth.
The flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be.
As little kids, I don't think we realized how terrorized we were. There was a mystery about Cuba that left a real scar in my heart. To think that there could be an end of the world for all of us. When I first met Fidel Castro, I think it really ignited something in me that, I didn't even know was there. I was asked to help found a board at the University of Washington called Center for Women and Democracy. And the first thing that we did was to get a license to go to Cuba. Before I knew it, I was at the airport meeting Senator Cantwell and 40 women.
Why don't you plan a wonderful trip to Havana? Caliente. Then I'll see you. I'll see you. I'll see you in CUVA.
The second day that we were in Cuba, we walked into a room filled with women, and it was a women's federation. And about 30 feet away from me was a very tall man with fatigues on and with a beard. It was Fidel Castro in the flesh. Fidel was there to greet all 40 of us personally, and I was petrified. I was meeting the monster. I didn't know what to think. The whole situation was so surreal. Surrounded by 40 women, he stopped for a minute and he said, I tried to create a utopia and I did not succeed. And I don't have time to fix it. And if you had come before this moment, I never would have said that to you. Well, that was a powerful afternoon. The Castro I had met did not resemble the monster I had always imagined from my childhood. And I asked the question, why do we still have an embargo against Cuba?
Mr. Dulles, I know you've heard this many times, that there are people who say that we, with regard to the CIA, are waging a secret war with an invisible government.
The idea that it is necessarily nefarious, it's always engaged in overthrowing governments, that's false. At no time has the CIA engaged in any political activity or any intelligence activity. It was not approved at the highest level.
Dulles is the director of the new CIA. His brother, John Foster Dulles, is the Secretary of State. Richard Nixon was vice president. We've been lied to since 1959 about Cuba, and we're still being lied to today. This unholy alliance between Nixon, the mafia, and the CIA, they're still impacting us today.
My father was a rather infamous individual. His name was Albert Anastasia. He became one of the most formidable people in the American mafia, and he was the head of the largest family in New York, the Gambino family. They worked in conjunction with, the CIA was not government controlled.
The most famous Cuban was Ricky Ricardo, in a weird way. Not Jeri Rice per se. My father came to the United States in 1933. There was a crazy, horrible revolution going on. My father's father was the mayor of Santiago de Cuba, and his uncle was chief of police. They were involved, you know, and it was Machado was running the country at that time. So his family was part of the administration. So when Batista came in and overthrew the Machado administration, all those guys had to go.
Police patrol excited crowds in Havana who found that while they slept, behind the scenes strongman General Batista had overthrown the constitutional regime of President Carlos Trio. Once before in 1933, when only an army sergeant, Batista staged a revolt. Now as then, his co-conspirators in the army, navy, and police seized key points. The present coup was accomplished in only 77 minutes, but Cuba's political freedom is ended as Batista cancels the June 1st elections.
Dad virtually told me nothing about Cuba. I think now that it was too painful to talk about. They burned the piano, they crushed his guitar, they slaughtered the pets. They killed his dog, you know. They, at the ranch, because he had a ranch down the road, slaughtered all of their livestock, set the ranch on fire. I mean, it's incredible stuff. In order to oust one of the administration, it was horrifying. Later on in the 50s, when Castro came in to overthrow Batista, my father must have been pretty thrilled, actually. You know, because you could remember Batista was not such a great guy.
Fulgencio Batista, in 1952, he made a fateful decision that really changed the direction of Cuban history to take over through a military coup d'etat and to declare himself president.
While Batista rules, there are 19,000 political murders. 11,000 people are exiled.
There were many people in Cuba that never accepted the Batista government as a legitimate government, and one young man in particular, Fidel Castro, who was a young lawyer in Havana at the time, became the de facto leader of an anti-Batista movement. A lot of the violence of those years in Havana, the repressive nature of the Batista government, goes hand in hand with the development of Havana by the mob.
People went to Cuba for a reason. They went to gamble, they went to experience the luxury of the hotels, and the shows that they put on were phenomenal. They did it with a class.
So all this money would come from the casinos into the counting rooms, and it would go right into the pockets and the private bank accounts. Batista got a weekly cash payment of $10.3 million delivered to the presidential palace in a suitcase on a weekly basis.
All of his life, Richard Nixon loved Cuba. Nixon got along great with Batista. He loved going to Cuba, he loved gambling, and he was a great poker player, tremendous poker player. Richard Nixon's best friend and business partner, Bibi Rebozo, has his own bank in Miami, which was basically a laundering place for mafia money. And Bibi Rebozo, from the 1950s until he died, was somebody who was mobbed up from the word go, especially with Meyer Lansky, who was one of the major mafia figures in Cuba.
The scene everyone remembers from Godfather Part 2, of course, is the gathering on the rooftop of all the mobsters. It's the birthday of the mob figure in the movie. Is a somewhat fictionalized version of Meyer Lansky.
These are wonderful things that we've achieved in Havana, and there's no limit to where we can go from here. This kind of government knows how to help business.
Meyer was one of the brightest men I've ever met in my life. One of the first things he ever taught me was, if you're taking money from people all your life, kid, don't be a sucker and give it up. We own these casinos for a reason. You cannot win.
The revolution is over. Havana's ovation for Fidel Castro himself had been long deferred. These scenes show his triumphal march across the island to the capital following the victory.
I got there in January of '59. The city was in a very gay mood, in a sense. There was no fear at all. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of joy because at that time, Castro was just treated as a complete hero.
Castro and his bearded troops were joyously acclaimed following his incredible victory over Batista.
Within a month, a lot of people started to sour. It wasn't what they thought was going to happen. We didn't know you were going to close the newspapers, confiscate private property, take the businesses, etc.
There had been this romantic image of the revolution, and then this new government conducted a lot of political executions.
Castro caused widespread concern over his war crimes trials. Within a few weeks, 250 men faced firing squads throughout the country.
Wow, this is not what we bargained for. We just thought we were going to get rid of a corrupt government.
They chased the mafia out of Cuba.
Batista fled and left the country quite broke. Fled with everything, every nickel that the country had, he absconded with. And so Fidel had his hands full.
The Cuban economy is on life support. How are they going to get money?
Castro came to the United States.
Now meet the press. Our guest, ladies and gentlemen, is the Prime Minister of Cuba, Dr. Fidel Castro.
Senator Smathers of Florida says that you have many communists in your government. Is that so?
And because Senator Smathers said it ought to be true.
When Castro turned communist, nobody really knows. There was strong suspicion within the CIA that he was communist, but they suspected everybody.
My father said, in this country, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. So he calmed right down, I guess, and said, you know, unless you can prove that she's done something or voted as a communist, the only thing read about her is her hair, and even that's not legitimate. Fabulous line, Dad.
I know you are worried. First of all, if we are communists.
I used to have a slogan about American policy in Latin America, which was, if you call a man a communist long enough and loud enough, he will become one. And that's essentially, I think, what happened with Castro.
I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear.
We made it United States policy to assassinate Fidel Castro. This was our policy, to bring down the Cuban government.
By the summer of 1959, the CIA is working with some mobsters to try and kill Fidel Castro. Nixon just ordered the CIA to ratchet up their plots with the mafia. Pretty audacious plan that's now been very well documented, but only in the last 2 or 3 years, when the National Archives found some files that really helped to lay some of this stuff out for the first time.
Dr. Castro, an American magazine published a story this week which says that Dr. Castro really hates America.
Why am I going to hate to the people of the United States? I don't hate anybody.
Eisenhower refused to meet with him, saying that he had a golf game, but he sent Nixon.
He hopes that he will get what all countries hope they get from America, which is some sort of financial aid. Instead, he gets a lecture and no offer of financial aid.
Nixon wanted to have a control factor somewhere, and Castro didn't want to give it up.
A reporter I knew witnessed what I'm about to tell you. When they emerged from the meeting, the reporters converged on him. They asked Nixon a question. One of his replies was, well, why don't you ask the big shot here? He'll have an answer for you. Instead of referring to him as El Presidente or whatever, ask the big shot.
Cuba's Fidel Castro boards a Soviet airliner to return to Havana.
Simply because Soviets are our friends. And here, you took our friends. Here in the United States, the authority rob our airplanes. And the Soviets land their airplanes.
I was still in Havana, and suddenly the skies darkened, and the animosity between Cuba and the United States began.
When I came home from Cuba, my focus started to change. My priorities started to change. And I kept trying to find out this story. You know, I didn't understand the dynamics of what created this place. This was an adventure for me. I wanted to find out how it really went down. I have done this project because I realized that there was way more to this story than America had been told.
Oh yes, of course. Each country has
their version,
own story.
In the Cold War, the Soviet Union was evil empire from an American perspective, but United States was evil empire from the Soviet perspective. And if you start to discuss from this level, you never find any common ground.
Only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it.
Sometimes I'm asked if I was afraid. I was too busy to be afraid. I was so intent on trying to help the president find a solution. Kennedy took office January 20, 1961. The CIA had already recruited, armed, equipped, and trained the so-called Cuban Exile Brigade with a plan to overthrow Castro.
I was basically recruited by some CIA. It was April, but it was very hot. We landed in the wrong place. We were supposed to land here, but we landed here. It was the wrong time, it was the wrong weapon. We ran out of ammunition very quickly. We ran out of gas.
Kennedy was assured Cuban exiles were going to be the only people involved in this operation and that there would be no fingerprints of the United States in any respect.
The CIA screwed the whole thing totally. There was an American task force with an aircraft carrier, 2 submarines, several destroyers, and landing crafts. Right there. You could see it from the land. And they did nothing. The Cuban government knew they were coming.
Everybody in Miami knew about Bay of Pigs. You cannot have hundreds of Cubans involved in anything and keep a secret.
Bam, 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 bam. I surrendered. I didn't have any weapons. There was nothing I could do.
Paramilitaries come into these swampy mangroves. They're just being shot down. I mean, it was sort of like shooting fish in a barrel.
John Kennedy and my father had very little to do with the Bay of Pigs until the last few days before the invasion. Nixon was the principal planner of the invasion. You know, he called himself the father of the Bay of Pigs, and he planned the thing from beginning to end. I think the momentum carried them into it, but when the time came where they said that it's a failure, you need to send in the military, he said, no, we're not going to do it, and that shocked them.
If their assumption was that a new president would be embarrassed into starting a war, that simply showed they did not know John F. Kennedy very well.
The last thing he said about the CIA as the invasion faltered is that he wanted to shatter it into 1,000,000 pieces. And he fired Allen Dulles as a result of it.
He was not going to risk American lives for CIA fantasies.
I mean, first of all, the concept of national security is one that has, I think, not been properly examined. It's one of those terms that we use all the time without asking ourselves what it actually means. The CIA was created essentially by a group of bankers. As it was explained to President Harry Truman, it was essentially for gathering intelligence, for gathering information so that the president could make intelligent decisions in the interests of the people. But instead, the CIA became a proactive organization for exerting influence in other countries, principally for the benefit of corporate and financial interests.
U.S. corporations could basically finance themselves in such a way that they were merging but acquiring Cuban operations and therefore taking them over from the outside. By the late 1950s, through financing, they managed to take over something like 80% of the railroads in Cuba, 25% of all of the financial assets in Cuba.
And this was never the intent of Harry Truman. In fact, some years after he was out of office, he said that he regretted ever signing the National Security Act of 1947. There's a long history of fabricated threats to U.S. national interests. One of the more egregious ones is called Operation Northwoods. This is a documented proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to John F. Kennedy that we create incidents against the United States and blame it on Cuba.
The United States would somehow blow up a plane and blame Cuba for it as a kind of a propaganda catalyst to invade Cuba. We have some Operation Northwoods documents here, which actually were military documents. Some of them are, I have to say, amazingly creative. They came up with a whole list of catalysts, economic, political, military, paramilitary, and even biological warfare that they could run against Cuba. That's an example of the types of schemes that the military was coming up with. Listen, one has to be clear. The military came up with schemes like that. The President of the United States never authorized them.
It had soon become apparent that Castro had sold out to Premier Khrushchev and the communists. He had brought with him a $100 million trade agreement and the promise of Russian equipment and technicians to help get Cuba's economy back on its feet. And soon a stream of ships from the communist nations, loaded to the Plimsoll line, had steamed for Havana. Khrushchev is sending Castro more than economic help. He is sending offensive ballistic missiles. With the facts now before him, President Kennedy calls in his top advisors and decides to address the nation. Now begins a period of intensive public guessing. The date is October 22nd.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
For my father's responsibility that he felt and understood, when we talk this responsibility of the leaders, of course they were responsible leaders, and we were lucky that they were leaders who was not such type like who first shoot then think. They prefer to think, then think second time, and then not to shoot at all.
Khrushchev and my uncle began a correspondence, a private correspondence.
Khrushchev sent a secret letter to Kennedy that he had personally written, and he sent it through a KGB man who had press relations job at the Soviet embassy in Washington.
Georgy Bolshoi. He was a very gregarious KGB spy, and everybody knew he was a spy, and the State Department CIA were horrified that he was at our house all the time. And he smuggled the first of 26 private letters between Jack Kennedy and Khrushchev.
The negotiations went directly. From one side to the another, it was this direct line.
And it was a recognition that both of them were under tremendous pressure from hardliners within their own government. Khrushchev from hardliners in the Kremlin, and he feared a coup, which ultimately came, and they deposed him. And Jack Kennedy, who also feared a coup. It's one of the reasons he allowed Frankenheimer, the Hollywood director, to film 7 Days in May in the White House to warn the American people that it was possible for a military coup to happen, and the Pentagon was dead set against it.
Suggesting, Mr. President, there's a military plot to take over the government.
There are some who will say it can never happen here. But this is the story of how it could happen.
Jack said there could be a coup in his administration if he made 3 mistakes the size of the Bay of Pigs. The first one was the Bay of Pigs. The second was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he felt that if there was a third one, that there was a possibility to actually have a military coup in the country, or a coup by the CIA.
This treaty is not the millennium. It will not resolve all conflicts, or cause the communists to forego their ambitions, or eliminate the dangers of war. It will not reduce our need for arms, or allies, or programs of assistance to others. But it is an important first step, a step towards peace, a step towards reason, a step away from war.
We now know from the archives that Curtis LeMay was out in the corridor saying that son of a bitch, somebody ought to kill him.
At the same time, the Kennedys were waging their huge war against organized crime. The CIA still hasn't given up on assassinating Fidel using some of the big mobsters that the Kennedys are prosecuting, like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante and Sam Giancana.
Then you would like to sit down and talk with President Kennedy?
Yes, because the enemies of Kennedy want to force him into a corner, into an abyss. And that abyss is the case of war with Cuba.
The press is standing up high, getting a lot of shots of this. He's broken away from his plan and gone right up to the fence to shake hands with people.
On the day that President Kennedy was killed on November 22nd, 1963, when my Uncle Jack was killed in Dallas, he had an emissary who was meeting with Castro at that very time. Jean Daniela was a French writer talking about the common ground between the United States and Russia. He held out an olive leaf to Castro, and he said to him, the United States history in Cuba has been a history of atrocities, and we understand that we're going to have to pay for that in one way or another.
Jean Daniel was talking to Castro about these very issues when an aide burst into the room and said, Kennedy has been shot. Castro turned to Jean Daniel, and the first thing he said was, they're going to say that we did it, which was exactly true. That's exactly what happened. But the second thing he said was, there goes your mission of peace. There goes your mission of peace.
I remember coming home from school that day.
One of the 2 priests called into the room has administered the last sacrament of the church to President Kennedy.
For the next 4 days, we never took our eyes off the television set.
My father was shocked, and he was upset, and he was scared.
We were all in shock. And my mother on one side and my father on the other side. And I remember my mother, when Oswald was shot, turned to me and she said, this has been a coup. And I didn't know what a coup was. But basically, I knew she was telling me we were being lied to.
even if you had 10 more commissions, you'd never get away from the idea that maybe there was a plot. We just didn't find any traces of it.
Some of the papers and some of the documents that are in the archives are there, but are withheld from public view by the FBI, the CIA. Is there anything in those which years from now, when they may be released, will upset apple carts?
Oh, no, I don't think so. No, I think everything that really is vital insofar as forming a judgment as to what really happened has been made available.
The American dream. At that time, you know, you believed what you heard. You believed everything that your government told you. I now better understand what was going on. What I don't understand is why we still have an embargo against Cuba.
Miami is not a typical American city. Miami is some kind of banana republic inside the United States. In 1961, I came to this country as an exile. I was in Cuba a journalist. Here I started again to work in my profession. And I observed all those waves of Cubans coming to this country. The Batistianos first, the Marielitos, the Balseros, and now the immigrants that are looking for a better way of life.
I'm one of those guys that came here with $2 in my pocket, scholarships to go to university. A lot of luck and a lot of hard work also. I'm the American dream.
I left Cuba when the prisoners of the Bay of Pigs were put in a plane and sent to Miami. So that was in '62.
We were taken to the G2 at the airport. We were separated. And my father was on the other side of the glass, and he saw us taken out of the room. You can imagine, as a 13-year-old boy, pretty scary not to know whether you're ever going to see your family again.
My family traveled to the U.S. every year. We were very pro-American.
We were going back to Cuba. We were sure that this wasn't going to last very long, and it wasn't until the Bay of Pigs that we actually unpacked.
Just 90 miles away, Miami feels the backwash of the revolution as refugees stream in.
Virtually all of my family left with Batista because they were in the casino business. My father supported the revolution. We left because my mother just could not stand her mother-in-law. We arrived in Miami, and an officer there told us about a plan that permitted Cubans to go any place in the United States with government money as long as they promised not to return to live in Miami. When my mother found out about this, she says, "This is wonderful," and she turns to me and she says, "We will be as far away from Herminia," that's her mother-in-law, "as we possibly can be." So she looked on the far left of the map and she said, "Jose Ignacio, what is the name of that city over there?" And I looked and I said, "It says Los Angeles." And she says, "Tell the Americano we want to go there."
One of the greatest casualties of the Cuban Revolution is the Cuban family. You can see this beginning most dramatically with Fidel Castro.
The central foundation of the Cuban economy has been the annual sugar harvest. Castro's father owned a large sugar plantation.
the 1940s, he meets this very pretty philosophy student, Mirta Díaz-Balart, through his best friend, whose name was Rafael Díaz-Balart. His father was the lawyer for the United Fruit Company at a time when the United Fruit Company was one of the most powerful companies in the hemisphere. Batista rewards the Díaz-Balarts with 3 ministries. Rafael introduces Fidel to Batista, and they offer him any job he wants. And basically, Fidel Castro's attitude was, I don't need a job from you guys. I've got my eyes on the whole enchilada. It becomes very important because when Fidel Castro leads an attack on the Moncada garrison, he's not only declaring war against the government, he's declaring war against his family. When he's arrested, who is supervising the prison? None other than his brother-in-law. So because Rafael is running the prisons, he had access to all the mail, and he was, of course, keenly interested in the mail between his brother-in-law and his sister. He took a letter from a girlfriend of Fidel Castro named Nati Revuelta, and he switched it with a letter to his sister, and needless to say, all hell broke loose. She left Cuba and saw Miami as the bright new future, Florida, South Florida.
Castro was eventually released by Batista, a terrible mistake on Batista's part. The revolution was based on a series of revolutionary tactics, and one of those tactics was to burn the sugar crop to show that he was willing to make the sacrifice himself for the revolution. The very first place where he began burning the sugar crop was his own family's sugar plantation.
What we can see is out of the Díaz-Balart-Castro split stems 50 years of poisoned relations between this family, the sons of Rafael Díaz-Balart in Miami, 50 years of poisoned relationships politically. The central dilemma of covering Cuba, and which really means covering the triangulation of the 3 cities, which is Havana, Miami, and Washington. What I kept coming across was broken families. There's a lot of passion, there's a lot of ideology, there is a lot of politics involved here, but there's also family.
You see, it all started 17 years ago. The travel folder on this cruise to Havana promised us romance, excitement, adventure.
Lucille Ball said, I'd rather regret the things I've done in life than regret the things I haven't.
Dad had an expression, one wave at a time, as opposed to one day at a time, or, But, the bottom line with my dad was, if it's not working, change it. Cubans are amazing people. They're very funny. They're extremely smart. They're just, yes, resourceful, because there's a brightness there, and there's a joy of living, a never give up kind of quality to them that is unique, I think, to Cuban people.
The Cubans are the only people in the world and in history where you have a number of citizens that have to choose whether to live with your daughter here or with your niece there. For generations, Cubans were accustomed to spend part of the time here and part of the time there because of the geographical proximity and the very close family links that has always existed. That was until 1958. It's a long story, practically half a century of U.S. involvement. Cuba is a rare country. 1 million university graduates that have hundreds of thousands of people studying now. Millions of Americans, if they knew just a little portion, the iceberg of this long story, I am sure that the Americans will finish with that.
And this is the mark of my generation. Now they call the lost generation. My name is Niels Reyes Cadalso. I born in Santa Clara, in the middle of Cuba. I live here in Havana and I pay my work. This painting is about the embargo on blockade. How we call blockade, the United States call embargo. The politics is one sense, but there is the other aspects like family, like culture, like music, painting, everything. Politics is only a small vision of this. It's not natural for us.
So when I went to Cuba, originally, it was to buy art. You know, Cuba, on a per capita basis, produces more artists, whether it's music, painters, than any country that I know of. I go there and my mind is just expanded, blown away. The Cuban people, those young entrepreneurs, the desire that you see in the people, even if they don't have the access to either funds or the possibilities of doing business, they have been cut back over 60 years. I mean, the embargo, you know, in many ways has kept the Cuban regime in place. The easiest way to keep a regime is to find a strong common enemy. And it's been used by Castro as the excuse for Cuba's lack of development.
The major premise of the American blockade of Cuba is to starve the Cuban people into submission or rebellion. It is a violation of all moral and legal standards to use the starvation of people as a foreign policy tool.
Well, the embargo was originally intended to wreak havoc in Cuba and create instability. There's no two ways around that. In 1965, Johnson then added food, are now part of the official embargo, and then medicine was also added as well.
I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue.
If a financial transaction takes place with American dollars abroad and an American bank is involved, that transaction is illegal. If a ship docks in Cuba to let off supplies that have been purchased legally by Cuba, that ship may not then proceed to an American port. It is a blockade that is unilateral only because no one else in the world wants to join the United States in this insane policy, but it is so extraterritorial in nature that it involves other countries whether they like it or not.
The UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn the U.S. embargo against Cuba for the 22nd year in a row. 188 countries voted in favor of the resolution, while the United States and Israel voted against it.
The blockade is aggressively extraterritorial and a violation of international law, which lacerates the sovereignty of other states. It's a transgression of the international rules that govern foreign trade and freedom of navigation. The cruel inclusion of medicines and foodstuffs is a violation of national humanitarian law. It's a hostile and unilateral act that should cease unilaterally.
Most of my generation left Cuba, and there is a few we stay here, but we live with the ideals of being free and being the Cuba we want.
Since 1966, there's been a law in the books that's unparalleled. In Cuba, they often call the Cuban Adjustment Act La Ley Asesina de Justa Cubana, the assassin.
To admit any Cuban landing there to the U.S., granting him or her, after 1 year and 1 day, the green card, the permanent residence.
The U.S. government wants to give the impression that Cuba is such hell that everybody wants to leave. It's extraordinary. We have an oppressive immigration system in the United States. Rather than wanting people who have overstayed their visas to get out and trying to deport them, the U.S. government is saying to these folks, come and stay.
It's really rather inhumane to tell people, I don't give you a visa, but you come here, no matter how, by killing a boat owner and taking the boat, or swimming, or by doing whatever it means. And if you manage to get to U.S. soil, then you are admitted. That's rather criminal. How many people have lost their lives trying to achieve that? I don't know.
It's a magnet for illegal and very dangerous immigration into the United States.
As Americans, we all remember Elian Gonzalez.
Off the Florida coast, fishermen rescue Elian Gonzalez after he survived a shipwreck.
A smuggler's boat headed to the United States flipped over and killed his mother.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, up till the Elian Gonzalez story, nobody really thought about Cuba.
The reason that Elian comes to the United States is a family squabble. The father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez, and the mother split up. But the mother, Elizabeth, struck up a relationship with another man, a man who had lived in Miami and had gone back to Cuba because he was a smuggler of human beings. And so Elizabeth planned with this guy the trip to the United States in this flimsy boat. And of course they wanted to take Elian.
In virtually any other instance, this would be an open and shut case. Elian Gonzalez would be returned to his father in Cuba. But this case involves Fidel Castro, the Cuban-American community in the United States, and the tortured politics that have made the boy a poster child in Cuba and Miami.
There's a venom in Miami that the American people didn't really measure until Elian came along.
We are holding the federal government responsible, and specifically Janet Reno and the President of the United States, for anything that may occur in this community.
What should be done here with the little 6-year-old boy is that people let the law take its course. We are just trying to make sure that people understand that what is at issue is a father who wants his son home. And these are bonds that should be honored.
I blame the President and Janet Reno for this. And whatever happens after this, let them pay the consequence.
the part of the story that the Cubans in Miami and the United States government didn't really get. There are many Cubans who want to leave Cuba, but there are many Cubans who want to stay, because Juan Miguel was tempted by a lot of people to stay in the United States and make political statements. In my presence, he was offered one time over $2 million. Juan Miguel is a waiter in a restaurant in Cuba. He makes very little money. But Juan Miguel was not tempted by money, and he was not tempted by Miami or by Disney World. He wanted simply to live at home.
It goes back to a professor that I used to have, and he used to say, Americans live to work, Cubans work to live. And it's just not all about making dollars. We all have very limited times, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, and it makes you think about what is it that you want to leave behind. Are the buildings that you build doing something great for the city that you're in? Are the actions that you're taking making the world better? The younger people don't have those deep-seated feelings that the older generation that is seen firsthand, that laws pass.
We have to look at what is real. Most of Miami was controlled, the political Miami was controlled by Batista people, who many people blame for what happened in Cuba. Because Batista, I mean, this is incredible. The guy got in a plane with $400 million, went to Dominican Republic in the middle of the night on December 31st. And how anybody defends Batista nowadays, and there's still people who do, you gotta be crazy. They immediately got involved in US politics with money that they took from Cuba, bought places in government and stuff like that. And that's a fact.
Reality is, this golden anniversary for the Castros is an impoverished anniversary for the rest of the country.
Yeah, there's a long history of the Cuban influence of many people that came from the island at the time of the revolution. This Bay, what they call them, the Bay of Pigs generation, when they came, they were frustrated, they were angry, didn't want any type of détente, any type of change of status until the Castros were gone and they need to be eliminated.
You have to look at the causes. There's two levels of opposition for two different reasons. One is the vested interest reason, and one is the deep hurt. The vested interest reason are those people that have made a business out of Castro being a monster and have devoted their whole life to espousing those ideas. Those people don't want to see a change because it affects their position in society. Then there's the ones that contain such hatred and such hurt that they can't see themselves opening up to a future that would involve forgiveness.
There'll be many who will never forgive. By the same token, there are people who consider forgiveness very important. That Jose Marti talked a lot about forgiveness. All the experience of going back to Cuba is bittersweet. My grandfather had been one of the people that built the Patronato, which is the synagogue for the Ashkenazis. And I actually sat in the same seat that I sat next to my grandfather the last time I was in synagogue in Cuba at that moment in time. I get goosebumps thinking about it. I went with my sister. Too difficult for my mother. My mother's still alive, always wants to go, though she doesn't like going while Castro's there. Some view the Castros one way, some view them another way. But there's a strong divide.
The political leadership of our members of Congress from the Cuban community, that's Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Congressman Curbelo, they're your traditional Republican Cubans, and they have a very pretty much hard line on anything to do with Cuba.
Should someone assassinate the Cuban leader Fidel Castro?
I welcome the opportunity of having anyone assassinate Fidel Castro.
The embargo is only still in existence today because we have that culture of secrecy that dates back to Nixon hiring the mafia to kill Fidel. So you had the same mob bosses working with Nixon on the CIA mafia plots and bribing him.
Eventually, the CIA's own internal inspector general was forced to do a history of CIA efforts to assassinate Castro, and he documented over a dozen specific attempts, ranging from using the mafia, the U.S. mafia, recruit a mole, first give him a poison pen. You can imagine the scene, which is actually taking place on the very day, at the very moment that John Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. One of the extraordinary coincidences of history, November 22nd, 1963, a CIA officer is meeting with this mole in Paris and handing him a poison pen and saying, this is the device that you will use to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro had not been happy about the CIA mafia plots, and apparently what Fidel Castro did was compile a dossier of all the CIA attempts, or as many as he knew about, which was not all, but the ones he knew about, and it was approximately 100 pages, and it was in 2 parts. Castro would face a hard task and say, hey, look at this dossier of attempts to kill me, and they started under Vice President Richard Nixon, and they're continuing today under President Richard Nixon. Apparently, Nixon, through these CIA operatives and the many Cuban exiles that were supporting him, found out about the existence of this document. And Nixon knew it wasn't just the plots to kill Fidel Castro, it was the fact that he was plotting with the mafia, and that he had gotten these big bribes from the mafia, not just in 1960, but he had just gotten a fresh bribe from the mafia. So Nixon had to know what was in that dossier. Did it have the bribes? Did it have the mobsters? If so, which mobsters? Which attempts did it have? How, did it have the 59 plots, the 60? He didn't know.
5 men wearing white gloves and carrying cameras were caught early today in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington.
4 of the men arrested were Cuban nationals now living in Miami.
Nobody knew about the CIA mafia plots. They were incredibly secret, and Nixon wanted to keep them that way.
By the spring of '74, things were getting very tight for Nixon. Somebody from the UN, the Cuban delegation, wrote and said Fidel Castro would be interested in talking about doing an interview for American television.
At the very end of the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger gave a note to Frank Mankiewicz, a Democratic Party operative who was going to Cuba as a journalist to interview Fidel Castro. It was a handwritten note, unsigned, saying, I'm interested in talks with you. Mankiewicz carried this note to Castro and gave it to him on July 18th, 1974. Castro read this note and he responded, this is a very serious communication. Will you take a note back? And the Cubans wrote a handwritten, unsigned note saying, yes, we're interested, and Mankiewicz carried that back along with a box of cigars.
10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Washington time, is the deadline for the 42 taped presidential conversations.
There's the release in July of '74 of the Smoking Gun tape. It's full of talk about the Bay of Pigs thing.
Without going into details and lying to them that he can't say it or no involvement, but we would say this is sort of a comedy of errors, bizarre and without getting into it. The president believes it's going to open the whole Bay of Pigs thing up again.
What is the Bay of Pigs thing? That's no secret. That was this big invasion that flopped, that happened after Nixon was no longer vice president. Why does he care about the Bay of Pigs thing? Clearly, to Nixon, the Bay of Pigs thing was the CIA mafia plots, which was the whole purpose for Watergate in the first place.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I've never been to Cuba. I got very close once when we were doing the 50th anniversary of the I Love Lucy show on CBS, and we decided that we would go to Dad's hometown, Santiago de Cuba, and we would go to Mom's hometown in Jamestown, New York. And then 9/11 happened.
The United States suffered an egregious attack of international terrorism on September 11th, 2001. We now know what it feels like to be attacked, to have our borders violated, to have our people killed. Cuba is a country that has suffered kind of variants of 9/11 for more than 40 years, or almost 50 years.
I had no idea that we were harboring terrorists in the United States. Then I heard the story about Cubana Flight 455.
Until 9/11 occurred, the worst act of terrorism involving a passenger plane was the downing of Cubana Aviación in 1976 by Posada Carriles.
We had an explosion and we are descending immediately. We had fire on board. That's the first.
Posada Carriles was no ordinary Cuban American terrorist. Posada was a CIA agent
whom we trained, whom we paid, whom we aided and abetted to conduct terrorist acts in Cuba, which were not terrorist acts because we were at war with Cuba.
This is not something that Cuba says without any evidence. It's not something that I say. It's something he says, and it's something that declassified documents from the U.S. Department of State, FBI, and CIA confirm.
My organization, the National Security Archive, obtained these documents from our own CIA, from our own FBI, that said point blank, this man was the intellectual author, organized the bombing of this Cubana airline.
When the plane goes down, the head of the CIA is George H.W. Bush. Bush was there as the CIA director in 1976, was later vice president of the United States in 1985, and in both cases, Posada was his boy.
To tell the truth, the Batistianos have the control of the media. Posada Carriles, Cubans from the 60s that were connected with the CIA, trying to overthrow the Cuban government with the backing of the American government. This is the past, and we are looking for a better future.
Cuban people want change. All the polls are showing that Cuban Americans under 60 are anti-embargo. The Cubans are saying, we would like to see development in our island, but we want to do it in a way in which Cuba maintains totally its freedom and its right to self-determination. There is no question in my mind that if they open up Cuba, the amount of money that is going to be flowing into that island is incredible. I think what is going to derail this, if anything, is the Cuban guys here, like Ileana Ross-Lehtinen and all those, their whole lives are predicated on spouting hate towards Castro. They're going to lose power.
May we continue to keep the light of freedom burning, and may we continue to move forward in the next 4 years on the high road to peace, prosperity, and opportunity, united behind a great president, Ronald Reagan. Thank you all very, very much.
Fidel Castro has always feared and loathed the Bush family, and not without reason from his point of view. Prescott Bush was one of the early champions of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The Dulles family, Alan Dulles, of course, running the CIA, and his brother at State, were among their closest friends. There's virtually nothing the Bush family wouldn't have done to support the Dulleses. They're good friends, but they were both politically and socially and personally on the same page. Earlier, George Bush, allowed his Zapata oil company to be used as a stepping stone during Bay of Pigs.
he had drilling platforms in the Gulf of Mexico perfectly situated for listening posts or whatever, on your way to Cuba.
Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, he was the head of the CIA at some time, but even before that, when he was an official in the CIA, he was involved in the terrorist activities promoted by the CIA against Cuba. He has personal connections with those people, and he has been very loyal to them his entire life.
Posada Carriles was imprisoned in Venezuela for blowing up his plane. He escaped, bribed his way out of prison with the help of Cuban American community, rich benefactors in Florida. He went immediately to Central America, where he joined the Reagan administration's secret Iran-Contra operations. He was actually paid from the money that flowed from illegally selling arms to Iran and being illegally diverted to the Contra War in Nicaragua.
Well, in 1985, the man who was running Iran-Contra by everyone's admission here in Washington was the Vice President of the United States, President George H.W. Bush again.
Luis Posada Carriles was involved in a huge plot to kill Castro in Panama in November of 2000, where he was arrested and imprisoned for 4 years. After he came to the United States in 2005 illegally, the Bush administration just let him wander around Florida. It is clear that his coming to the United States was part of a broader plot to attack Cuba again during the second term of the Bush administration. You say to yourself, the United States has a double standard. The United States is hypocritical. The United States is deliberately harboring an international terrorist because this terrorist once worked for the Central Intelligence Agency.
If anybody harbors a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they fund a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they house terrorists, they're terrorists. I mean, I can't make it any more clearly to other nations around the world.
It is hypocrisy writ large. I really grew anxious about where we were headed, and one time I had a conversation with my wife, and my wife simply said, well, if you're torn over your loyalty to Colin Powell versus your loyalty to your country, I don't think I need to tell you which one comes first. It's not a feeling that anyone with a conscience doesn't experience almost weekly in the United States government when you have to answer an otherwise legitimate and sane question with a bureaucratic answer which purports to defend everything the United States stands for, including freedom, democracy, mom and apple pie, and you realize that what you're saying is, if not 100%, at least substantial hypocrisy. And this wasn't just with regard to Cuba, it was with regard to the terrorism list in general.
It's that American dream in your childhood and being naive and being trusting and finding out that we were not told the truth.
I will readily admit that leading up to and including the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba presented a clear and present danger to the security of the United States. But my God, that was a long time ago, and Cuba is now not exporting revolutionaries, they're exporting doctors. Much has changed in Cuba.
What are we hearing about Guantanamo? Hunger strikes, accusations of torture. Just what's happening to the 166 prisoners still there?
To me, it's always struck me as strange that we would put this prison right in the middle of Cuba and then let it become such a black eye in the world. And then say, but the guy over here is the really bad guy.
What we've done with torture and harsh interrogation, and with Guantanamo as the stellar example of that, is probably as much damage to our relationships with the rest of the world and to our prestige and reputation, which is part of our real power, as we've ever done before.
This is a world upside down. Cuba would be a different place if it didn't feel threatened, if it didn't feel that the most powerful nation in the history of civilization was trying to topple its government, or that it posed a national security threat.
Something very tragic that we have dreaded for a long time, I believe happened today. I believe we lost our first pilots.
Brothers to the Rescue is a manifestation of this very, very bad relationship we have with Cuba.
To the exile community, they're heroes. To Castro, provocateurs, who repeatedly breach Cuban airspace.
They were flying planes into Cuba, supposedly to drop leaflets, innocent leaflets, on the island.
I don't for a moment condone the shooting down of the aircraft. I don't think anyone who had any compassion at all could condone that. But I do understand the dilemma that the leadership in Havana was presented with.
We had the right and the duty to defend Cuban sovereignty and Cuban independence, and that's what we did.
The Brothers to the Rescue basically changed their mission. They had been ordered not to fly. This particular flight was not looking for anybody. They were flying as a daredevil type thing.
They were using planes that the U.S. military had previously used in Central America.
They are constantly violating Cuban airspace, and on occasion has these planes come over and drop firebombs, or has these planes come over and do things other than just drop leaflets.
And I ask that we honor the memory of those lost to the cause of liberty in Cuba and redouble our efforts to turn their dream of a free Cuba into a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
What would be the reaction if a plane from Saudi Arabia were to come in unannounced and without authorization into U.S. airspace repeatedly?
Had that happened to us, we'd shot them down. No question in my mind, we'd shot them down.
We will not tolerate attacks on United States citizens, and we will stand with those both inside and outside Cuba who are working for a peaceful transition to freedom and democracy.
Bill Clinton, facing an outcry from Congress, gave away the presidential discretion on the embargo.
The embargo cannot be lifted by the president, period. That is over. After Helms-Burton codified the embargo. It can't happen.
Years, you know, you have not gotten the results that you want, or over 50 years. The definition of lunacy is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. At some point you have to say, how can all the world be wrong?
Maybe it was the forbidden fruit of Cuba that made it so delectable that we weren't allowed to love to go there. We couldn't, it wasn't on the plate. You know, you weren't allowed to choose Cuba. And when you have a gem, this little gem that God made out there, that the waters are, you never see colors like that, you know? And that's just in pictures. I can't even imagine what it's like up close. And people whose hearts are bigger than the universe, and their humor is so real and authentic, you know, and the culture is full of music and love. I've never been to Cuba. I don't want to wait so long that The Cuba that my father may have known is gone.
Cuba is crumbling, literally crumbling in front of your eyes. I want to do something about that.
I decided to go back to Cuba, which was not easy. Being a Bay of Pigs veteran and the General Counsel of the Cuban American National Foundation wasn't a good resume. Something here I don't understand. My trip was approved by the State Department. By the Cuban side, it was approved too. Something very interesting happened there. They introduced the lawyer of the Council of State, and he made his speech, and then he came directly towards me and said, oh, this guy is going to tell me, mercenary, get out of here, that kind of thing. I was expecting that. The opposite happened. He welcomed me to Cuba as the son of his professor of constitutional law was my father. The entire board of directors of the Cuban Bar Association invited me to dinner. Very, very emotional.
I cannot say it better than he said it on Toast of the Town, Ed Sullivan.
We came to this country and we didn't have a cent in our pockets. From cleaning canary cages to this night here in New York, it's a long ways. And I don't think there's any other country in the world that would give you that opportunity. I want to say thank you, America, thank you.
He grabbed it for what it was. He said, okay, that was then and this is now, and now I live here. And he made his Cuba here. And I think a lot of people had to do that.
Most people who are living in this country today should know that my father and my Uncle Jack wrote Khrushchev back from Cape Cod as we all played around him. And he described us playing in the yard. And he said, you know, looking at the children, this is what we're here about. It's about creating a planet and preserving a planet from the kind of destruction that we can both rain down upon each other.
There's just the kids left, trying to change things, trying to shake some sense into people.
My father told that they have one thing in common with the President Kennedy. Both of them really wanted to prevent the war. I wrote that if Kennedy will stay in power in the next 6 years, maybe the Cold War will end it in 1969, and we will fly together to the moon.
What kind of peace do we want? Not a Pax Americana imposed upon the rest of the world.
By American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children.
My father taught me that if you're not a student of history, you're doomed to repeat it. We have lost so much culture from the Cuban people, so much joy, so much music, so much art.
I think that Cuba was used in a lot of ways by a lot of people right here. It was a political pawn. Poor little thing, poor little pretty little country, just used. We're part of the problem that Cuba's ended up the way it is. That we instigated a lot of what went on there. And that just makes me so sad.
People send me the different magazines with the covers. At last I started to collect them. So I have here, I think, about 60 or 80 different magazines, most Americans and Soviets. And then also it is posters of my lectures. I believe that will be some drops that add some knowledge to the public, American, Russian, the world, to make this world safer and better. Because all of us are people. We want to live in peace, to live together, and not to kill each other, not in New York, not in Kabul, not in any other country. Please.
You learn the lessons of the past, but you forgive and you start trying to create a new world in which are more open to ideas. When people can get to that level, then I think everybody improves their ways. We should treat Cuba just like any other country. It is just a country that happens to be our closest neighbor.
The embargo today makes no sense at all. If Kennedy had lived, I don't think he would have continued it.